From looking at Japanese prints, often small in scale and highly detailed, our visitors walk into the next section of the exhibition and are confronted by something very different. This is a life-size portrait of Anna Elizabeth van Reed, who is the mistress of Slottswillen Castle, just outside Utrecht. It was painted in 1678, and it shows her wealth, her status, and her style. And as you can see, she's wearing a garment that looks exactly like a kimono. Now, during the Edo period, Japan enforced a very strict isolationist policy known as a closed country policy. The Dutch were the only Europeans allowed to trade in Japan. Dutch brought fabric to Japan, which were incorporated into fashionable kimono. Checks and stripes that were so popular in Japan actually originated in the fabrics that came from India, such as this wonderful piece here. This is actually a man's undergarment, showing that despite the conventions of male clothing, many men indulged in a bit of flamboyance when it came to their clothing. Dutch records show that they were often given garments by the shogun, by other regional lords, and these caused a real stir when they arrived back in Holland. There was a tradition in Europe for men to wear loose, long, open robes. If you were a man of letters sitting in your library, this is something you might have worn. But these kind of robes were tended to be fairly plain. They were often just in greys or browns, lined with fur to keep them warm. Suddenly, these incredibly beautifully decorated, brightly patterned kimono came to the West. The Dutch realized there was a real commercial opportunity here, so they commissioned makers in Japan to make robes specifically for the European market. They were slightly adapted. They didn't have the longer hanging sleeves, the sleeves were more tubular, and they were much more heavily padded. So not only were they fashionable and quite exotic, but they also were incredibly warm. The Japanese really couldn't keep up with the demand for these kind of robes. So the Dutch turned to artisans working on the Coromandel coast of India. And they started to create these colourful robes in the kind of fabric that we think of in the West as chintz. Very few actual kimono arrived in the West from Japan during the Edo period. But this all changed in the mid-19th century when Japan was forced to open its ports to foreign powers. Suddenly there was a great flood of goods came to Britain, Europe and America, causing a craze for all things Japanese. The Japanese silk merchants were very quick to capitalise on the new market. This at-home gown, as this style of garment is known, was sold by the silk merchant Shino Shobei, who established what could be called the world's first global fashion brand in 1859. And he established a shop in Yokohama, which was the treaty port, and he sold to Westerners who were there, and increasingly for export to shops such as Liberty's in London. As you can see in its style, it's completely European, but it's made of beautiful Japanese silk fabric with sophisticated embroidery. The actual kimono themselves were very, very fashionable to wear. And this kimono at the back here belongs to the V&A collection. The museum bought it from Liberty's in 1891. Many of the garments that came to Europe were of the style that would have been worn by samurai women. Japan changed very dramatically in the late 19th century. The sort of external pressure brought to bear by European powers arriving in Japan, coupled with internal unrest, which led to the overthrow of the shogun and the restoration of the power of the emperor. And the new emperor, the Emperor Meiji, moved his capital from Kyoto to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo. Samurai women who had been living in Edo returned to their domains. They no longer needed the very formal garments they used to wear. So lots of textile merchants found themselves with unsold stock, and some of it they sold to enthusiastic Europeans. This such piece here, of the style that would have been worn by a samurai woman, found its way to London, where it was owned by Elizabeth Smith, who was the wife of George Murray Smith, an eminent publisher. And it was this garment she chose to wear for her portrait. As far as we're aware, this is the only known pairing with a portrait of someone in a kimono with the actual garment. And we're lucky that this survives today in a private collection. As I mentioned earlier, kimono are worn in layers, and it would be up to the wearer to choose the different layers that would work together harmoniously. But in the Meiji period, there became a fashion for actually having matching layers, as you can see here with this garment. And the under kimono, they don't use the same fabric throughout. There's this sort of very bright red fabric, which would have been cheaper to produce on the main body of the undergarment. But at the hem, it has a simplified pattern, the same as the outer garment. And the patterning here is of tea-pick. As you can see, it's very small and very subtle. The Japanese, as ever, were quick to realise the great fashion for wearing kimono in the West. And in the early 20th century, they started to produce what was specifically known as kimono for foreigners. And this is an example here from the V&A collection. We've just been looking at the very sort of subtle and understated styles that you see in Japan in the late 19th, early 20th century. But you can see the kimono that's made for a Western audience are very, very different. Beautiful satin silk, very boldly embroidered here with wisteria and birds. But there are other interesting characteristics. Japanese realized that women in Europe wouldn't know how to tie an obi, so they just provided the garments with a sash, often with tassels in the same fabric. And also, interestingly, they would add extra panels into the kimono. Here, a sort of triangular panel at the back, center back, creates a garment that drapes more like a skirt and can be worn over petticoats.